thank everybody for coming to this Zoom meeting. Peter Rombo, and it's my pleasure to introduce Paul, our MP for Nanaimo Ladysmith. Paul was first elected in the by-election in May 2019, and then re-elected in the general election in October later that year, 2019. And Paul had tremendous support from Protection Islanders. He got close to 60% of the Protection Island poll vote, so that's pretty amazing. So we can sort of think of him as our personal MP. Paul had a life before he became an MP. He was a documentary filmmaker, and he made films on a number of issues, environmental issues, watershed protection, revitalizing First Nations languages, and healthcare. And Paul's long-term goals, at least according to his executive assistant, I hope she's told you what they are, is to ensure protection of the environment and have social justice within this country. And his specific goals, I think, are very relevant to Protection Islanders, in particular when you look at our average age over here. They are universal farm care, national standards for long-term care, and guaranteed a livable income within this country. So I'll let Paul tell us his story, and I think you'll find Paul, unlike a lot of politicians, actually answers your question when you give him one, rather than rambling on about something else that he might find of more interest or to obscure the issue. So without further ado, I'll introduce Paul Manley to the Zoom crowd.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. So yeah, I started life actually as a professional musician. I studied jazz at Humber College in Toronto. I played professionally for 10 years. I actually had a management company decades after that, a decade after I stopped playing professionally, where I did record deals, international record deals for some bands that did the jazz festival circuit all over North America and Europe and the festival circuit. And I got into filmmaking because my mother was into filmmaking, documentary and educational films. My father, some of you will know, was an NDP member of parliament for 8 years. And when he was a member of parliament, I never thought I'd want to do his job because I never saw my dad. He was always busy, always seemed to be stressed out and buried in work. And so I actually pursued what my mother was doing, which was filmmaking, and got into making, I partnered with my mother on a number of films, including films about residential schools, environmental issues, human rights in Central America. And one of the films that I worked on was about the Security Prosperity Partnership, which is about international trade. It was about deep integration of North America after 9/11. And when I was working on that, I learned about the investor-state dispute settlement provisions that are in all of our trade agreements that Canada has signed. And investor-state dispute settlements are used by corporations to challenge our laws and policies when they get in the way of their profits. And they're used by foreign corporations. So foreign corporations have rights that domestic corporations do not have through these provisions in the trade agreements. And that really got me interested in federal politics. I ran municipally in 2005 for city council, and I was number 11 of 39 candidates. And I didn't run again because I had started working on that film about the SPP in 2007. And that really just got me focused on that. So at the federal level, I have a number of portfolios because there's only 3 Green MPs. I don't know how Elizabeth May did it as 1 Green MP because there's 27 critic areas, 27 committees to follow, and I have 9. And I have volunteers, university volunteers that monitor those committees for me. I could read through all the Hansard records. I follow the committees that have active legislation going before them, or ones that have a particular interest for me because of the concerns in the riding. The focus that I take as a member of parliament is to focus on the riding first, on constituents and constituents' needs, and then looking at number two, looking at my critic roles, so the legislation that's coming before Parliament and working on those issues, and then branching out if I have the capacity to deal with some of the other issues. And it also depends on what's coming up in the region, what's coming up in the country, and what's coming up internationally that's affecting people. So one of the first things I started looking at was I received a bunch of emails about Nanaimo Seniors Village and the conditions there. Now, Nanaimo Seniors Village, it's a long-term care facility, different levels of care, but it's a provincial issue, except that Nanaimo Seniors Village is owned by Retirement Concepts, and Retirement Concepts was bought by Onbang Insurance, which is a Chinese insurance company, with the permission of the federal government. So it became a federal issue. And Onbang Insurance had a corruption scandal, and the CEO of the company was charged and jailed, and the company was taken over by the Chinese state. So our long-term care facility here in Nanaimo Senior Village is owned by the Chinese government. And so I started to look into the issue, and I'd heard and I read about the situation before with that facility in particular had been sold multiple times. And every time it got sold, the employees were laid off, and then the ones that weren't troublemakers were hired back. Troublemakers like wanting to unionize or have better working conditions. They were hired back part-time wages, no benefits, and had to work in multiple homes for something that they were trained to do. And so by the time 2019 rolled along, people in that home were making 25% less than the going wage in other facilities. They were understaffed. The staff were stressed out, and people in the facility were not getting the care that they needed, and in a lot of cases were you would call it abusive through neglect. People were left in soiled beds. They weren't getting proper nutrition. They weren't having their needs met at all. And so I was bringing this up with the federal government, and in March, just the week before the pandemic shut everything down, I had a debate in the House of Commons about it based on a question that I asked, and was really digging into it. Of course, what we've seen since that time is that long-term care facilities are where the majority of deaths are due to COVID-19, because it's just ravaging through these facilities, these homes. And in Nanaimo Seniors Village was lucky because it was taken over by VHA before the pandemic. And in British Columbia, there was an approach taken to ensure that there were no part-time workers floating from one place to another, that people were assigned to a long-term care home, and that's where they worked, and they couldn't go from home to home, which was what happened in Quebec and Ontario, also where there's 4 beds to a room. And then we do have facilities like that here too. But the private care homes were where, the vast majority of deaths were taking place, some 80% of them. So that was a major focus for me. Leading up to the pandemic, I was looking at a lot of different local issues, like the anchorage issue. We have this interim protocol that allows freighters to anchor, all through the Southern Gulf Islands. And I know that it's an issue on Protection Island, and I've talked to the Port Authority about this. And I know that when you talk to the Port Authority, some of those anchorages have been moved off of protection a little bit more, that they've actually given you a bit of a break on it. But those anchorages are all paid for. So that, and there's a time limit on how long freighters can be there. The ones in the interim protocol, they don't pay for those anchorages. And there have been days where there's 37 ships anchored in the Southern Gulf Islands in those free anchoring spots, and only 2 of the anchorages here that are paid for have ships at them. So you can see that ships are like choosing, that these shipping companies are choosing the free parking over the places that they have to pay for. And so that's an issue that I've been digging into and looking at other examples around the world. In Australia, they had a problem with coal ships in the port of Newcastle. They had up to 80 ships anchored offshore at times waiting to get into the coal port. And people complained about it, and the government did nothing until one of those freighters washed up on a popular beach after dragging anchor. And then, of course, it became something that the government was focused on. And so they've put in a vessel arrival system, and ships have to contact the port when they're 14 days out. And if the port isn't going to be ready for them within 14 days, then they have to slow down and take a little longer to get to port, which actually reduces the amount of bunker fuel that they burn, saves on the amount of greenhouse gases that they put out. And then they arrive at port, and 60% of the vessels arrive and pull right into port. Only 30% of the vessels have to anchor, and the average anchorage is 3 days. And so here we're seeing anchorages in the Southern Gulf Islands that are going, over a month and sometimes up to 2 months. And in the port of Rotterdam, they set up something similar, a just-in-time system, because they didn't want ships offshore pumping diesel fumes into the air. They can't burn bunker fuel near the port, but they can still burn diesel. And so they set up a just-in-time system there. So these are things I've been bringing forward to the Parliamentary Secretary and the Minister of Transport, and working on with the industry, meeting with the Port Authority in Nanaimo and the Port Authority in Vancouver, and plugging away on these issues. I'm very focused on poverty and disability. So some of those are my critic areas as well, but I've worked with a lot of people in the diverse ability community in Nanaimo, and people that have to rely on disability payments live in a form of legislated poverty. So they're allowed to earn $12,000 extra a year, and then every dollar after that gets clawed back. And so they kind of max out, I think it's like $14,000 for an individual, and then they can earn another $12,000. So they max out at $26,000 a year, and then everything gets clawed back on them. And we need to have standards across the country to ensure that people with disabilities are treated fairly. We have, the first question I asked in the House of Commons was about affordable housing and the homeless crisis that we have here. And that was my first debate as well. A bit of an interesting moment, because I wasn't exactly sure all the different systems and how they work, but within the first week I was elected in May, because it was at the end of the session, they extended the session till midnight every night. And I get this notification on Thursdays that come through at 10 o'clock. And if you're on it, you click for a late show adjournment proceedings debate, and then you get to have a 10-minute debate during adjournment or right after adjournment. So I clicked on that, and the parliamentary secretary who was responsible for housing had talked to me right after my question, came and introduced himself, and we had a good conversation. But then the late show thing came in, and I clicked on it and said, yeah, I want to, you get 35 seconds to ask a question in the House of Commons, and you get a 35-second answer. And I really wanted to discuss this more. And then I found out that meant I was going to be debating at midnight. And so I ran into the parliamentary secretary. We have different lounges on either side of the House of Commons, the opposition lounge and the government lounge. And we don't really intermingle much, except that we all share a bathroom. And so I ran into the parliamentary secretary in the bathroom, and he goes, and I used some unparliamentary language, You're going to make me debate you at midnight about homelessness and affordable housing? I said, yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't, like I could cancel if you like. I didn't realize it was going to be at midnight. And he was going, no, it's no problem. We'll have a good discussion, right? And so he's somebody I've worked on building a relationship with to deal with the issue in our community. And we have a really serious issue here. Affordable housing is, of course, a complex issue. We have right now hedge funds and real estate investment trusts and pensions and numbered companies that are investing in real estate. We've had a problem with money laundering and the use of Canada as a tax haven that has driven up the price of homes in Vancouver, and that is affecting us here now. And so it's just not sustainable. Working people cannot afford to live in this community if they're looking for a place to rent now. There's just the cost of renting in this community has just is going out of reach for a lot of people. And then and also a lot of people are moving here, economic refugees from the Lower Mainland, COVID refugees from the Lower Mainland, people who want to get out of their condos. And now a lot of snowbirds are coming here in the wintertime because they can't go south. And so right now we're like at a 0 vacancy rate, and anybody that loses a place to live right now is in serious trouble. So that's an issue that I've been plugging away at as well. One of the things I started to get fired up about, excited about, I don't know if you know, but I've made a few different films about watersheds on the island. One called Voices of the River, which is about the Nanaimo River watershed. And it looks at the history of the ENN land grant and how that has affected watersheds, community drinking watersheds on Vancouver Island, but also the ability for First Nations to negotiate treaties. So if you're not aware of it, when BC joined Confederation 150 years ago this year, 1871, they wanted to join all the capitals by rail. And so they needed to build a railway originally it was going to go from Campbell River to Esquimalt, but it ended up going from Nanaimo to Esquimalt, the ENN Railway. And to do that, they got Robert Dunsmuir to build the railway. Apparently he was reluctant at first. So he put a deal on the table that he thought maybe they would say no to, but he was a cabinet minister in the government at the time, and the richest man in British Columbia. He owned the town of Wellington, Extension, Ladysmith, as well as the company stores in those towns, and most of the coal in the Nanaimo area. Built himself a castle down in Victoria, Craig Derrick, and his son built Hatley Castle, which is now Royal Roads University. So he got 8,000 square kilometers of land, 2 million acres, plus $750,000 in 1876 to build the ENN Railway. And he basically got the southeast coast of Vancouver Island, and all of that land was privatized. So in the Nanaimo drinking watershed, and in the Nanaimo watershed, the whole watershed at 756 square kilometers, only 0.6 square kilometers is parkland, a couple of small postage stamp sized RDN parks, and 10.4 square kilometers is in conserved area, part of the estuary, and in a couple of mountaintops for the Vancouver Island marmots, the endangered marmots. The rest of it it's all private land, and it's an issue I've been working on. I did a film called Voices of the River, and then Troubled Water, which looked at watersheds up and down the island and compared them to what Victoria did, which was to buy back the ENN land around the Souk Lake watershed so that they control the logging that happens there and who can access the watershed. And one of the things I found when I was in the House of Commons was that there's a process that's been going underway for the nature legacy, and that's to create conserved areas. So it was 18% of the land base and 18% of the marine base by 2018, and then 25-25 by 2025, and 30-30 by 2030. And so there's a national marine protected area that's going to be going in the Southern Gulf Islands and come up as far as Gabriola. And then there's a program called Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, which works in tandem with First Nations in their territories to actually have what's really a regional sustainable development model. It doesn't preclude having economic activity, so logging, or mineral extraction, but done in a way that respects the biodiversity of the region, and is kind of in tandem with conservation efforts. And so, we're dealing with a biodiversity crash. It's as important as the climate crisis. The number of species that are going extinct, from, the ones the megafauna that we know, like rhinoceroses and lions and tigers and bears, to the insects that we rely on for all kinds of different things. So it's a program to help bring back biodiversity in some areas and to protect biodiversity. And so this is something I've been working on with the local First Nations in the riding to get them interested in this idea, which they hadn't known about, and work on that as a solution to reconciliation for the ENN land grant. So Nanaimo signed a treaty in 1854. That treaty was completely ignored with the land grant. And all of the First Nations who have territories within that land grant, they're basically looking at Crown land that became Crown land because taxes weren't paid on that particular parcel. That's how little Crown land there is. Every mountain you can see from your viewpoint on the ferry from Protection Island, it's all private land. There's no Crown land on the southeast coast of Vancouver Island. So those were some areas of focus for me. There's a number of things I was working on just with Vancouver Island Economic Alliance on economic issues, other issues with First Nations in terms of policing, and other areas of concern. A lot of different files going on, really based on local issues. With the policing issue, they weren't happy with the level of policing and the quality of policing on local reserves in the local communities. And that's actually an issue that's nationwide. So sometimes I can, talk about these things and they're actually national issues. First Nations isn't one of my portfolios, but because it's a real concern here, that's something I've worked on. My films, by the way, you can see online for free on YouTube. You just search my name and films. My company name is actually used to be my mom's company, Manly Media, so you can find films there. Then the pandemic hit, and so I was working on a bunch of different things, and suddenly we were all going home, and it was it was just a very stunning kind of moment to be leaving the House of Commons at that time. And I'd already changed a lot of the practices of, you go to, typically during a parliamentary session, during the day, you're in Parliament all day, and then there's meetings with lobbyists and different organizations, and then there's receptions, and there'll be like 5-6 receptions going in an evening, and you kind of focus on the ones that fit into your critic areas. And they're a more informal way of meeting with different groups and organizations. And I would go to all the ones that kind of fit into my critic role, whether they were with organizations I agree with or not. So, I went to the military, what do you call it, Manufacturers Association, and go and ask them some tough questions about autonomous weapons and about why they sell weapons to places like Saudi Arabia, or and I just get into ask some difficult questions, and it's an opportunity. Like at first I thought, I'm not going to go and meet with organizations that I disagree with. And then I thought, no, you know what? You have access to these people that nobody else has access to, and this is the place to go and ask questions. So I will, have meetings with Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and with the military manufacturers and whoever else, and I'll ask questions that would come up from constituents about, about what they're doing, and actually had some interesting discussions and debates about, the hazards of fracking and what that does to our environment and to climate change and things like that. And it was interesting because with CAP, they didn't have some of the research that I had, and they thought that they were going to do an end run on me. And by the end of the meeting, they were like, "Well, you've really done your homework here." I was like, "Yep, that's my job. If I'm going to oppose what you're doing, then I need to do my research to be able to articulate what those problems are." So I would go to these receptions, and before COVID hit, we could see it happening in other places. So I stopped doing the handshake thing, started to be more cautious about these things. But then when COVID hit, we all headed home, and we didn't have anything in place to deal with the House of Commons. So I had to go back a couple of times during COVID when we had special sessions as we were working to figure out the hybrid parliament. And there was kind of an informal agreement that we could only have so many MPs in the House at a time, I think 70. And so because there's 3 Green MPs, we were only allowed to have 1 in the House. And the first time we went back, we were really dealing with the main opposition party wanted to just bring everybody back to the House. And we were like, this is kind of doesn't work with health orders, and we need to find a way to do this properly. The first time I traveled back, it took me 24 hours to get to Ottawa because there were no flights. I had a choice of leaving at 5 o'clock from Nanaimo because there was 1 flight out, getting a hotel at the Vancouver airport, and then getting into Ottawa the next day at 5 o'clock, or leaving at 5 o'clock and then getting in 16 hours later after spending most of my time in airports on a red eye. And that just didn't seem like a pleasant option to me at all. So I took 2 trips back to Ottawa like that, which were just strange journeys, traveling through the airport, hearing warnings about staying away from people and social distancing, and wandering through the airport and with my video on my iPhone, and you couldn't see anybody. There was nobody in there. The airports were completely empty, and I was wandering through. So we would get to the House of Commons, and at the beginning, there was a lot of collegiality around, we're all in this together and we need to work through making sure that we take care of Canadians. And so there's what's called unanimous consent motions that everybody needs to agree on. So 1 MP can say no, and a unanimous consent motion fails. And then if it's, on some of the measures like developing a hybrid parliament, we have to have unanimous consent, or it ends up going into debate for several days to go through the process before we can vote on it, and then work on the majoritarian system of passing through legislation. So we had those sessions at the very beginning. There was briefings every day. So I was on technical briefings every day on COVID to find out, what was happening with the government, what was happening with COVID spreading, how we were going to deal with all of these issues. And then in the summer, we had special sessions. So normally the House adjourns around June 21st, and it doesn't come back until the 3rd week of September. And we don't sit in the summer at all. That's when we're at home in the ridings, and we do the work in the ridings and have meetings and with constituents and work on local issues. But we had sessions in the summertime to go back and actually sit in the House of Commons. And we had an agreement, a unanimous consent agreement, that we would have a proportional sitting. So 70 MPs representing 338 MPs instead of having everybody crammed into the House. And then in September, when I went back, at the end of September, I was there for, I think, a 3-week session, and we came up with a hybrid model for Parliament. And that was interesting because we were voting on Zoom, and the way you vote on Zoom is normally in the House of Commons, you're not allowed to leave the room you have to be there when the question is asked, and you can't leave until the vote is counted. And you have to stand for each vote. Sometimes when you get a series of votes, if you have to go to the bathroom, it's too bad. If you leave, your vote isn't counted. And the same thing happened on Zoom, but on Zoom it takes longer because the clerk has to say your name, and then you have to clearly, tell the speaker, I vote this way or that way. And sometimes people didn't have their mic on, or Zoom was kind of clunky, and then you have to go back. Each MP who got their vote missed could put their hand up in the chat, and then the speaker would go back and count their votes. So the first few votes took a real long time. And then we managed to get it sped up. Now I've got an app on the phone that we don't have authorization yet to use, but it has facial recognition, and I have 5 minutes to vote. There's usually 30-minute bells that tell you, like, get ready to vote. Then this thing will actually let you vote. When I did the test, I could vote the wrong way, then vote another way, and then vote another way. And each time it does a facial recognition thing, a couple of different ways, to ensure that it's me that's operating the app. And then your vote gets counted. And of course, our votes are all public. So it's not like we're, hacking is going to be something that, and messing with the votes is going to be something that we're as concerned about, but ensuring that it is the MP that's voting, and making sure that all the votes are counted and that your vote came in correctly is the important part of that. And so it's a very secure kind of system that they've set up, but we don't have unanimous consent. We haven't gone through a process of approving that yet. Tomorrow is the first day of Parliament. We didn't have a motion to continue the hybrid Parliament after the December break. So tomorrow, first thing, there's a unanimous consent motion that changes the standing orders. The standing orders are how the Parliament operates, and then we can make a determination, we all agree that we're going to continue on with this hybrid Parliament. And generally what happens is the House leaders will negotiate with each other, behind the scenes, and they come up with the wording, and then the wording goes out to all the MPs, and this is basically what's been agreed on. So I was going to fly back to Ottawa yesterday, but because this unanimous consent motion had already been agreed on, if it hadn't been agreed on, then we wanted to make sure that somebody was there in the House of Commons to represent the Green Party. But thankfully, I don't have to do that. I actually really miss being in the House. Like, I enjoy being in there for debate, but it's an opportunity to have casual conversations. I would leave my seat and go and speak to a minister, sometimes give them a letter directly, talk to them about an issue that we're dealing with in the constituency. And it's a way to build rapport and interpersonal relations. And so I do have the cell numbers for a few different ministers and parliamentary secretaries that I've been working with on different issues. I take a different approach to politics. I actually send my questions before question period to the minister, because I want a real answer. I want them to think about what it is that I'm asking. And after I'm always sending them research and why I'm asking this, what the problem is, trying to outline it for them, and work with them, because that, I think, is this game of gotcha politics and trying to always point the finger and the blame game, I don't think is a healthy way of interpersonal relations at all. And we're all human beings just trying to do what we think is best, and sometimes what I think is best isn't really the right thing. And so I have to be open to change my mind based on research and evidence-based decision making. And I'd approach other politicians the same way and try to work with them. And I miss that aspect of working in the House of Commons where it's easier to build up some of those personal relationships. And Elizabeth May has been amazing in that. She knows all of the MPs that have been there for a while, and the different ministers. She just works a room like crazy, and that's how I think you get things done better than trying to always be hyper partisan and be tearing down. So I really miss being in the House of Commons. I'm glad when this pandemic is over, but the trip back to Ottawa when Ottawa, Ontario is in a state of emergency with a stay-home order, and the city of Ottawa is basically locked down, and it just didn't seem like the responsible thing to be doing. We've got a ban on unnecessary travel here, and if I can take part in the House of Commons through Zoom, then that would be the responsible thing for me to do. And so that's why I'm here now. So I don't know if people have questions. I can go on for quite a while, but I want to save time for people to ask me stuff.
All right. Does anyone have any questions you can feel free to unmute yourself, or if you're more comfortable, you can type it into the chat box and I can ask Paul your questions for you. But that was a great talk. It sounds like everyone's had to learn how to be adaptable and flexible to the new way of life, as everyone else is doing.
Yeah. No, it has been a real learning experience, I think, for a lot of people. Initially, too, there was a lot of we're all in this together kind of Team Canada approach, and of course, if you've been watching, that has changed. One of the interesting stories, when Donald Trump was saying he was going to cut off the export of PPE to Canada, I sent the Deputy Prime Minister a note because I've had lots of chats with Chrystia Freeland, and I just sent her I said, here's a fun fact, and I sent it to her and the Prime Minister and a couple of the Minister for Industry and Innovation and the Health Minister. I said, here's a fun fact. Our pulp mill here, Harmac, produces the material that you need to create PPE in the United States. So we are actually supplying the United States with the raw materials that they need to create the masks and gowns that they don't want to send us. And so, of course, Chrystia Freeland thanked me for that, and got in touch with the Trump administration and let them know, and then they backed right off. It was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? And so she gave me a shout out in the House of Commons. That's just part of, like, we're all trying to work together for our constituents and for Canadians and to do what's right. Have you worked much with your new party leader? So yeah, we've been working with Nanaimo since she's been elected. We've been working on different issues. I've been on a couple of different town halls with her. One dealing with long-term care homes and that situation, because that's one of my portfolio areas that so it's an area that I've been doing a lot of research on, but also speaking for the caucus on. And then the CERB overpayment, we did a town hall on that, and the CERB is actually not an overpayment. It was a unclear rules situation where, at one stage, Bill Morneau, the finance minister, was telling people who are self-employed that you could base your income on your revenue, on your earned revenue. So, it's the issue between what's gross and, you were supposed to, they changed the rules. They made it clearer that it was your net, that you had to have $5,000 net if you were self-employed, not $5,000 gross. And a lot of people got caught up in that. The government sent out 441,000 letters to Canadians before Christmas telling them that they might have to pay up to $14,000 back for a CERB overpayment, when they were actually doing their due diligence and thought that they were doing the right thing. And the CRA was confused. People at the CRA answering questions were confused. Government MPs made the same, they were confused. They didn't know what the rules were, and they told some of their constituents, yeah, you can apply for the CERB if you're self-employed based on the $5,000 gross. And the issue around that too is that we have a benefit for people for rent subsidy for small business. But if you are a home-based business, you can't get that rent subsidy. But you do subtract a portion of your rent and your bills from your gross to get to your net. And a lot of people that were caught up in that got those letters are like single moms who had a small home-based business, people who get disability pension, who had small home-based businesses that they were using to supplement their income. People who actually poured a lot of extra expense into their business in 2019 because they were changing a product line, because they invested in equipment, because for whatever reason their income was down in 2019 compared to 2018 and 2017. So I did town halls with her on that, and we have regular meetings to discuss upcoming legislation and what we're doing. Let me just catch up here. So that was Kate's question. Rick has a question. Can you comment on whether a minority government can be more productive than a majority? That's a good question. In some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. So the minority government has to work with other parties to be able to maintain governance. If they get voted down in a confidence vote, and confidence votes are generally money, so budgets, but you can also just call something a confidence vote. And if you lose the confidence of the House, then you have to go to an election. So they do have to work with other parties, and that means that there's more flexibility, there's more compromise, and an ability to work together. On the other hand, there's been some things where the opposition's able to gum up the workings of the government through filibustering, or when there's been motions that have come forward from the opposition parties that all of the opposition parties have voted for, and the government couldn't stop those motions. So in some ways it means that we have to have a lot more compromise in the House of Commons to keep a stable government. And in some ways it's easier sometimes for the opposition to gum things up a little bit. Kate's asking about food security. It's a big issue. Anytime, even more during COVID, will Canada ever have a food security policy? And are you working on this as part of the poverty issue? Yeah, I've been working on food security a lot. This is also something that's very near and dear to me. One of my films was about the 5-acre farm, which is part of the original bread basket here in the Mid-Island region. And ensuring that we produce enough food locally. So I've spoken about this in the House of Commons a number of times. During some of the debates around COVID relief, I brought it up that we really need to increase local food production, and we're seeing the price of food going way up during COVID. That's one of the issues that we're facing, is the increased cost of food. And we need to, Canada's a net exporter of food, but it's grains and pulses and meat that we're exporting. And we're an importer of lots of other things that we could be producing here most times of the year. So, that we have transport trucks that cross in the night carrying the same produce, some heading south from BC and some heading north from California, when we could be lowering the carbon footprint on our food by ensuring that we have a better local food supply. And there's lots of different ways to do that. We can't grow everything all the time, but we, so we need to think about how, when we eat local, like that we eat seasonally as well. But food security is something that we definitely need to be plugging away at. Yesterday, this is a question from Norm. Yesterday, the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons came into effect. Sad to see that Canada hasn't signed on, let alone ratify. Any thoughts from NWFZ of Nanaimo? NWFZ?
Nuclear weapons free zone.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things I was doing in the last couple of weeks, like right after Christmas, actually, I took part in a series of NATO briefings with Brussels and the American Embassy. So every morning at 7 in the morning, that's one of the things about being out here in BC, is that business starts at 10 o'clock. Typically, like the House of Commons starts at 10 o'clock in the morning. There's a few one morning that starts at 11 Monday mornings, and then on Wednesdays it starts in the afternoon, but it's 3 hours ahead. So at 7 in the morning, I have to have a jacket, a tie, and be in front of Zoom and ready to go. And I could be on Zoom in Parliament for 8 hours in a day, and then do meetings on Zoom afterwards. So having Zoom over Christmas was never it was difficult to want to be on Zoom anymore. But one of the things that came up in those NATO meetings is that NATO is a nuclear deterrence alliance. It is one of the main aspects of that alliance is using nuclear weapons as a deterrent for war. And so that's one of the reasons why Canada hasn't signed on. Canada has also said that we don't have nuclear weapons, so why would we take part in this treaty? But I think that it's part of a responsible conversation on how do you reduce the number of nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation around the planet. That having a treaty like this is super important. So, yeah. We have a nuclear weapons-free zone here in Nanaimo. It's not something that is terribly meaningful. It's a political statement more than anything else, because we don't have nuclear installations right here. We've had nuclear submarines coming into the new space, to the American base there, but it has really no effect on how this treaty would work, or how what we would do around that treaty. But we're definitely pressing on this issue, and there was an all-party, except without the Conservatives, there was an all-party press conference on it, including a Liberal MP, Nathaniel Erskine Smith, who is kind of stepping out and from the government side and saying we need to sign on whether the Prime Minister wants to or not. Okay. Kate wants to know how hard it has been to maintain your bipartisan stance when you said Francis May as party leader maintained. What? Bipartisan stance? Elizabeth May? Sorry. What? I'm not sure, like the non-partisan stance you mean, Kate? You're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute.
Yeah, duh. Sorry, my head's been in Scotland for a while. Yes, sorry, not Francis. Excuse me, that's my cousin, Elizabeth. And yes, the wrong term. Yes, you know what I mean. Sorry.
Well, I think Annemie and Elizabeth have different styles, and I think that it's interesting because when you're outside of the House of Commons, you take a different approach to politics than when you're inside. I've always kind of had a problem with the hyper partisan nature of politics. And before I was a politician, when I was just a filmmaker, I was always very careful about what I said about politicians. I disagree with policies and some of the ideas, but don't get into the personal ad hominem attacks and just stick to the issues. And I think that's how, we need to work with other people. We don't heckle in the House of Commons. We follow the standing order rules, but I get heckled like crazy in the House of Commons. And, it took a little bit to kind of get used to, but I just kind of go with the flow. Sometimes I'll shoot right back. And that doesn't necessarily work because you don't hear what the other side is saying. With a hybrid parliament, when you heckle, you pop on the screen so everybody knows who's heckling. And it's actually getting shut down a lot more, which is a good thing. And beside COVID, what's been most difficult for me personally? Actually, what's been really difficult is just the number of constituents that are having a really hard time. It's hard to see people in the community that are just going through so much difficulty economically. We've had a lot of people who were trapped overseas that we were helping originally, like when, in the spring, we were working really hard to get people back into Canada. And at one point, I dropped $12,000 on my credit card to fly a family of 3 people back from India because they couldn't buy their plane tickets in India. And I just kind of put a little bit of trust and faith that they were going to pay me back because they were running out of medicine. And we've had that situation in other places where we actually arranged in the Philippines for the ambassador to arrange for medication to get flown into a remote location because the people that were there couldn't get the medication that they needed and they couldn't get out of the country. Trudeau said he's disappointed that President Biden canceled the Keystone Pipeline. My comments, the writing has been on the wall on the oil and gas industry when big investment firms like Blackstone aren't investing in oil and gas, and they're pulling back on those kind of investments, and they're looking at the cheap, they're keeping the cheap solutions but not going for the more expensive solutions. When you see national oil companies like out of I've lost it, but you're seeing, in Saudi Arabia, they're moving money into renewables. In Norway, they're moving money into renewables. Norway had pulled money out of Canada. They pulled their investments out of the oil sands. A lot of big companies have been doing that. And then for governments to continue to push forward on this when the writing is on the wall and they can see that the big investors aren't investing in it, and then they decide that they're going to throw public money at this, it's just ridiculous. So we see that with Keystone XL. We've seen that with Trans Mountain. Kinder Morgan was laughing all the way to the bank when the government of Canada wrote that check because these are going to be stranded assets. And the same thing with LNG Canada up north. The European Union, the central banker of the European Union, just came out and said gas is over. The era of natural gas is going. But here we're putting $6 billion into subsidies for LNG Canada, which is not Canadian at all. It's 5 foreign multinationals. It's Mitsubishi from Japan, Royal Dutch Shell, Petronas which is a state-owned company from Malaysia, Corgas, which is a state-owned company from Korea, and PetroChina, which is a state-owned Chinese company. And they're all getting these massive subsidies to build this facility to export fracked gas, and we're going to provide cheap power through Site C to do this. It's when the government has to start throwing money into technologies and industries that are over 100 years old, and the big money has left, then we're in trouble. So those are my comments. I don't think it was a bright move on the part of the Alberta government at all to begin with. There's a question from Adrian. Thanks for taking the time to for us. Appreciate it all, as always. Ms. Samra, former CAO of Nanaimo, has recently been hired by the Trudeau government on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. By all accounts, she created a toxic working environment at City Hall. How can the government ensure appropriate vetting, especially in the light of the Governor General? So that's an issue. I don't know, what the process is. I know that Ms. Samra has a human rights complaint against the city of Nanaimo right now. So perhaps the government isn't looking at all of these things, or couldn't bring that up in interviews. I'm not sure what the process is around that hiring, and so I really can't comment on it. And then Kate, where is real affordable housing and homelessness at in Nanaimo? So there's a number of projects that are coming forward in Nanaimo. Housing was downloaded to the provinces in 1993 by the federal government. They stopped putting money into affordable housing, started cutting it back in the 80s and 90s. It was downloaded to the provinces in 1993. The province of British Columbia and Quebec kept that responsibility. In other provinces, they downloaded it to the municipalities, and in those provinces, it's actually a much bigger problem. So there's a number of affordable housing units that are going to be built here in Nanaimo coming up. There's money coming in from the Reaching Home program to help with the homeless population, and typically I think we get about $870,000 a year for Reaching Home, and there's been an extra $1.2 million that's come in this year because of COVID. There's the Rapid Housing Initiative. There's been some projects that were that came out of this area for that initiative for federal funds, and then CMHC has opened up funding for housing projects to municipal governments and local organizations, housing organizations. So there's things that are moving, and I've been advocating really hard on rapid funding for those applications that have come through here. Yeah. So we're at 2:02.
All right. Well, thanks very much. That was really entertaining talk. And before we sign off, Rick, our president, I would like to give an announcement.
Okay. Yes, I just, well, first of all, I just wanted to thank Paul. So heartening to hear that you're talking to other MPs and trying to work together. The recent examples of how fragile our democracies are, especially south of the border, I think everybody working together is quite a heartening thing. So wish you luck in that regard. I think it's going to be a long year, but before everybody goes, I have a couple quick announcements here. 2 weeks from today, Pat Trask will be talking about dinosaurs of Vancouver Island. So if you got children, grandchildren who want to tune in, I would encourage them. Pat's a great speaker, and he's going to have some good audio-visual stuff, and learn a little bit about what we can find on Vancouver Island. There's a couple of things I wanted to share with you, but I'm going to have to share my screen. Hopefully I can do that, Emily. I think I'm allowed to, great. So there's a couple other things coming up here. So let's start with this one. So we've got a new speaker, March 21st. So I thought I'd show you what it's going to be about. Don't have to read it to you, but Scott Fleming and his crew put up a bird tracking tower at Beacon House last week, and it's a super interesting project that basically encompasses 2 continents and tracking birds from north to south, and it's a really fascinating topic, and now we're going to be a small part of that as well. So Scott's agreed to give us a talk March 21st at 1 o'clock. He's a pretty good speaker. A little entertaining to hear how they were establishing a tracking station in the Arctic, and they had to keep going back because the polar bears kept eating all their wires. So it should be a pretty entertaining guy to listen to. And then a special treat that nobody probably knows about yet, but in April sometime, Protection Island players are going to do a virtual play. So it's going to be pretty interesting. Here's the details, more details to follow as they kind of work their way through it. But I think that's definitely something that's going to be very entertaining, as they've proven in the past. So that was kind of it for the announcements. So I will get out of that shared screen there, and thank everybody for coming.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for being here to listen, and appreciate the opportunity to talk to the community. Anybody that ever needs help, my staff are always more than happy to help out, and I'm happy to help out on any issues. And appreciate the work of the Lions Club. These community service organizations do a lot of really good work in our communities. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul.
Take us off mute. Yay, thank you, Paul.
Okay.
Thanks, Emily.
Take us off mute.